All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from. I am super excited today because I don't get to do this very often. So, normally, when you join this channel, it's a lot of conversations regarding HR tech and everything else. But today is actually one of those things where I'm like, after I met Melissa, I was like, we have to have this conversation, especially given everything else that is going on in the professional world and just understanding a lot of the challenges that professionals, especially women professionals, are experiencing, if you will. So if you are joining us live today, I would love to learn where you're dialing in from, what your background is. Feel free to ping in the chat. And also, this is a chance for me to do a tech check and make sure that we're actually live and everything is working as planned. Now, while you're doing that, Melissa, I am going to ask, where are you joining us from?
Long Island, New York.
How's the weather?
It is raining and snowing at the same time, but I hear it's going to be 40 degrees at 1 p.m.
Oh, that's it's cold. So I just came back from Toronto yesterday and I'm now back in Dallas, Texas, and we're in the 70s. It was a bit of an atmospheric change, to say the least. So again, if you're joining us, feel free to join us in the chat as well. Would love to know where you're dialing in from, how the weather is where you are. And then let's get started. So Melissa, when I host a lot of these things and I ask folks to introduce themselves, one of the first things that they always tell me is their professional background, title, and everything else. So let's start there. Let's start. How would Melissa introduce herself in a professional setting?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I think from a professional setting, I'm wearing a multitude of different hats right now. So I am the founder of Malu Journey, which is a program focused for women going through a personal or professional change. And the curriculum and program has been curated by licensed psychologists, therapists, and business coaches. I'm really excited about that. I also own a consulting organization called Fit for Future. And that's where I do organizational transformations, just like the typical offerings I've done in my past at Profit, Slalom, Accenture, and so on and so forth. And then I'm also the fractional head of strategy and research at Coquel.
Awesome. We've got someone dialing in from the snow globe that is New Hampshire today. I sincerely wish you can join me in Texas right now because it is sunny and glowing outside. It's a bit of a shock. So all of the professional titles, and I think for a lot of our listeners here today, when they're being asked to introduce themselves, it is also coming from the lens of who am I? What are those titles that I carry with me? And what are some of those conversations that those titles or the rooms that those titles allow me to enter? So, Melissa, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit just something different for our audience today because it is related to the conversation we're about to have. Pushing all of the professional titles aside, let's assume we have now dropped you into a remote island where nobody understands the concept of corporate America or anything along those lines. Who is Melissa? How would you introduce yourself as a person?
At the core, I'm a person that questions the status quo. I'm a person that speaks up often when others are silent. And I always go back to this kind of origin story. I grew up in a town in Long Island where there weren't many Asian families. And I remember, and Chinese was my first language. I was walking down the street with my mother, and Malu in Chinese, the direct translation is horse road. And I remember being so frustrated as a kid. And my mother asked me, Melissa, what's going on? And I was like, why are we calling this road horse road when there are no horses on the road? And she knew then at the age of 3 that I was going to question the status quo. So let me give you a little bit more information of what I mean by that. So in college, I fervently believed that they didn't have the studies and curriculum that I wanted to pursue. So I actually pitched to the board my own 2 majors. I'm still the only person that graduated with those 2 majors from my college. When I was at Ogilvy and Mather, I had left consulting to go in-house for a short time period. And I recognized that Ogilvy was spending so many dollars on their consulting services, but I had to change every deck and change everything. And so I pitched to the CEO as well as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer to be the partner of transformation because I would save them X amount of dollars. And I got that approved. And so that is kind of at the core who I am. I even at my consulting organizations, I rebranded myself. I was known for org effectiveness, and then decided that I wanted to learn sales and account planning. So I rebranded myself to sales and account planning. So, and when I reflect upon it, most of my proudest moments weren't and aren't in my job description.
Say a little bit more about that. I know we didn't prep this question necessarily. And hello, audience, if you're joining me for the first time, you know that I skate a little bit while we're on these live events with our guests here. So talk to me a little bit more about the fact that it's not in your job description. And maybe let's also dial a little more into how the internal dialogue you had to have with yourself at that moment in time to be able to say like, hey, I don't like what this is, and here's my idea.
Okay. So one of the examples of what's not in my job title and that gave me joy was when I was at Slalom Consulting, I helped create the first successful women's sponsorship program. And I remember that wasn't part of my job description. I was supposed to sell, I was supposed to deliver work. But after working for the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Ogilvy, I couldn't unsee what I saw. And at that moment in time, there weren't actually any women in executive leadership positions in the New York metro area. And I had to ask myself, do I leave and find, another place where the culture looks a little bit different, or I could see myself in these roles, or do I stay and do something about it? What do you think I did? I stayed and did something about it. And so I partnered with I partnered with HR. I partnered with a plethora of different leaders to really get the data to understand how many women and how many men were in the recruitment pipeline, how many of them got their offers accepted, how many people were promoted. But I removed all the names because it's not a blame game here. You're not going to get anywhere with a blame game. You're going to get where you need to go by really understanding people's commonalities and getting people to focus on a vision and a same goal. So when I pitched the entire executive committee, they were all, white male, probably in their 50s and 60s. All previous came from Accenture. And I recognized that, as a woman or as a feminist, many people might say, oh, I have a daughter, or I have a wife, or I have a mother. But I knew that necessarily wasn't what makes you a feminist. In fact, I eye roll when I hear people say that. So I thought to myself, how can I grab their attention? And I thought, oh, maybe it's their legacy. So I created a deck with all the data, but I started with a black slide with white letters. What do you want your legacy to be? And then I focused on the competitors in the market and who else had these programs in place. And I said, do you want to be ahead or do you want to be behind? And they all said, I want to be ahead. And so one by one, they said, I approve it. And actually, it wasn't until 6 months as part of the program, they had this aha moment where they realized they were getting, they had a role, and some of them were getting in the way of people's success. But being able to understand their lived experiences, and these women, by the time I left that organization, it was 50% women and 50% men. And that wasn't part of my job description, but it made a true impact. And that is one of my proudest moments.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. And I see a few folks joining us here in the chat. So if you are joining this live right now, welcome. We are happy here to host Melissa Ann Goldner from Malu Journey, talking about her breakup with corporate America. And feel free to ask any questions. We can engage as we go along for the next hour or so here. So Melissa, I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit. Okay. Before you had the aha moment, if you will, and I'm just setting the stage for our audiences here, you carried the title of a partner at a consulting firm. And having come out of consulting myself, I know a lot of the folks joining us here earlier on in their careers, they do look at people like you with a halo on the top of their heads, going like, oh my God, this is so amazing. She made it. What was that path like for you, experiencing it yourself for the number of years that it took you to get to that title?
Well, first, I want to say congratulations on not of leaving consulting. Bravo to you. um, what was it like to get to that title? It was your question.
Yeah.
If I were to be honest with everybody, I'm not sure that I actually ever dreamed about becoming a partner at a management consulting company. I'm a daughter of two Chinese immigrants that came into the United States to really create, a life and find the American dream. And when I was very young, in order to honor our parents, they said that there were really three main buckets of jobs that were my options: a partner at a management consulting company, similar to my father, a doctor, or a lawyer. And this has a lot to do with Asian culture. I'm sure that for those that identify with Asian culture, that might be a little bit of a similar experience. So I think I was just in pursuit of honoring my immigrant family, but because they've provided me so much resources and privilege, that I wanted to honor that. I think what I missed was asking myself the question, is this what I want? Because at the end of the day, if it was my dream, my hypothesis is that I would experience some joy while doing it. And when I was a partner at a consulting company, what looked great on paper and what might have looked like a halo on LinkedIn or my resume, I was actually on my way to a panic attack for 3 months straight, dealing with postpartum anxiety and depression, trying to work with therapy for my first time in a long-term perspective, and reclaim and figure out who I was again after becoming a mother. So,
Wow. So what I'm hearing is that there is a lot more to the whole story on the other side, above and beyond just the professional title that you were carrying back then. So let's break this down a little bit more then, because I think our audience are probably curious about this as well. Let's look at the first, I want to say maybe 3-4 years after you came out of college. If you can turn back time and go back and converse with the Melissa back then, or I'm going to call the analyst, junior consultant Melissa, if you will, what would you tell her? What would that conversation look like?
so I probably have to take a step back and um, talk a little bit about the environment that I was in. My one of my first jobs out of college, I started as a recruiter, and then within 6 months led the recruiting department for an IT and business consulting company, a global one. And then within a year, the head of HR left the organization. I was asked to be the head of HR. So at the age of 22 for 400 people globally. So I just wanted to give some context. And I think that was an interesting experience because in most of when I reflect upon my life, it's usually overcoming was, a big part of how I identified, like overcoming traumas or overcoming a challenge. And, for this one, it's okay. Well, I didn't study HR when I was in college, but throw me into the ocean, I'll learn how to swim. Um, in retrospect, there were a couple things that it took me a while to get a lesson learned. So number one was, I think that I was addicted to award collecting for the majority of my life. When I was in high school, I was the first chair violinist since freshman year of high school, and I beat somebody in Juilliard, which was a big deal for my Asian family. I was an early partner in my career at Ogilvy, and then same at the last organization that I worked at. But I think if I were to look and reflect, I didn't realize in my early career that leadership is not a title. I thought that I was doing the right thing. Thought, and I was really proud that I was one of the youngest leaders in the executive team and responsible for all this. But I realized, because I was so focused on climbing up the ranks and pleasing the executives, that I lost sight of what I was actually supposed to do as the head of HR, which was to care about the people. And I learned it the hard way. One of my team members told me, Melissa, like, you're not focusing on the right thing. And that was such a true gift. Another thing and ever since then, I decided, oh my goodness, like, leadership are the people that are actually at the bottom lifting everybody else up. And so that was a lesson learned early on in my career. And the second one is, and this is kind of personal, but when I grew up in Long Island, my grandpa on my dad's side lived with us, so he was kind of like a second father, if you will. He picked me up from my school, my high school and middle school. Like he would walk there, make sure I'd walk back, and um, when I was the head of HR and grew really quickly, his health declined, and um, I was so focused on thinking that my job is so important and that I couldn't leave that I booked my flight out a week out. And he passed away the day before my flight. And I regret that. I think, most of the things in my life I don't regret, but I do regret that. And I promised myself at that moment, if this ever happens again, I will know to prioritize my family. And I often think about this because when people talk to me about losing somebody close in their lives, right? Or um, just a trauma that's happening in your life, I think life gives you these natural life sifts, if you will. Like if you're thinking about like hunting for treasure, um, that when these core things are happening to you, you get this rejigger where you finally have the dust settle and you recognize what's actually really important in your life. And so I promised myself from that moment I would never make that same mistake again. And so if you fast forward, when I was at Accenture, my grandmother on my mother's side wasn't doing well. I actually sold my apartment in Arlington, Virginia, and moved the hell back to New York City so I could be close to her, because that's actually what matters in life. You're not going to be on your deathbed thinking, oh my gosh, gee, I don't even remember what I was working on that week in HR. You're never going to be remembering that. You're going to be remembering the relationships and how you showed up for those that you love.
That is, wow. I just have to say, wow. Couple moments I want to stick on a mug, which is leadership is more than just the title that you carry. Because I think a lot of times when we work in a corporate environment, we look at titles and we assume certain things, consciously or subconsciously, that comes with those titles without recognizing the downstream impacts of those, so to speak. I think a lot of us may be on the receiving end of certain return to office orders or certain interesting, I'm going to say, corporate moves at this point in time and at this juncture that we're recording this. But I'm really genuinely curious for all of the practitioners and HR practitioners out there, how many truly look at their leadership role as the one that is serving people and not just ticking the boxes and checking off orders, if you will. So going back to your story, Melissa, what was that mid-career like for you, in between the sort of head of HR role for a 400-person global firm and a partnership role at Ogilvy? What was that experience like? And again, if we can all jump in the time machine and go back with you, what would you tell yourself then?
I think from early career to mid career, I was always in conflict with my authentic self, which is the person that questions the status quo, and then pulled by like cultural norms of, as an Asian woman, we should keep our heads down, work hard, um, respect hierarchy, respect your elders, and that got me in a lot of trouble. There were some bad people out there that took that like for granted, and like sexual harassment, molestations, like even just being bullies within the organization. I think if I were to talk to my mid career Melissa, um, I didn't speak up for myself. There was a manager at a consulting company that told me that my personality was too big and to act Asian and put my head down. And then there was another abusive manager where two people on my team ended up in the hospital from stress induced issues, just to be in the same, they had to be on medicine to be in the same room as that individual. And I think it took many of those types of cases for me to actually be like, no, like this isn't right. It didn't feel right, but in my culture or in, corporate America, we're told like it is what it is, right? You deal with it, you power through, you work through. Um, but I appreciate, even though it might have been like multiple like pans on the head for me to finally speak up. And so I think speaking up is something that's really important. I will mention one scenario. There was a scenario where the head of sales at an organization was like sexually harassed me ever since I started that company. But I didn't say anything because I was afraid that he was a revenue generator and that my job would be at risk. And that year, I actually brought in probably 25 new hires, entry level from a plethora of different colleges and universities. And one happened to have long black hair. Um, and apparently, she was standing in the hallway, and that head of sales inappropriately touched her from behind. And he came into my office and said, huh, oops, I inappropriately touched an employee thinking it was you. And I think that was the kind of bang in the head that I needed, because I realized, because of my silence, because I didn't speak up for myself, it actually really hurt somebody else in the process. And I should have thought about that. And so when I stick up for myself, we're actually helping all those that come after you, and so I reframed that in my mind ever since that. So that would be a lesson.
Wow. Um, so I know for those audience listening right now, some of you might have just heard that story and had a bit of a discomfort or cringe moment. If you do, I would really encourage you to kind of think about what brought that about, if you will, because there is something that Melissa said that resonated very deeply with me, which is, if you don't do something about a situation that you don't think is right and are currently experiencing, eventually someone else will suffer the negative effects of all of that. The other different angle I look at it as, it's more so you're currently walking on a path that someone else has paved for you. What are you going to do to make that path better and pave it for the person and people who come after you? So, Melissa, we do have a comment from Michael here. For many people, we shift in the middle of our career or middle of our lives from focusing on what we're trying to accomplish to what we're here to give. Melissa is the embodiment of this. Um, so yes to everything, Michael, that you just said, and a little bit more. So, Melissa, I think I want to pivot the conversation a little bit again, because the title of this session is My Breakup with Corporate America. And I know you and I came up with this session title because we're like, you know what? It's fun, it's provocative. Having gone through the journey similar to yours, I will say it's anything but fun and provocative at certain points in time, even though depending on how we package it on the surface, some may look at it as oh, this is amazing, like I should have a breakup with corporate America as well. So tell us about your breakup story. What was it like? What brought that about? How did it all start?
I have to say, it started with the culmination of all those stories that I shared with you, from early career to mid career, to even, as an executive at an organization. I really do believe that everybody has their own journey. And so for me, that movie Inside Out, I didn't know. I wish we had that when we were kids, okay? Because I had no idea that I was a high functioning person with anxiety, um, at scale. I thought that that is what everybody else experienced, and to just work through it. I thought that that was what you're supposed to do. Like, my identity was raveled up in my ability to overcome. Like, I was proud of that. I think where I faulted was that I never had joy as part of that equation until recently, until the breakup. And I will say, um, usually I'm the one who does the breakup in my personal relationships, but this was actually a breakup to me, So, in my last organization, I was part of a layoff, and it really shook me to the core, because I didn't start putting my authentic self out there or have the bravery or courage to do so until maybe probably a year or two prior to that. And so when an organization decided to, break up with me, I felt like they were breaking up with Melissa at the core. When, an organization might not have been doing very well, right? I still immersed myself in coaching others and creating safe spaces for people to talk, and going against the grain and sticking up for what was right. And I think what was the biggest aha for that breakup was I lost myself in the title. I think I lost myself in the attempt to be one of the first like Asian executives so that my family, my children would be like, "Oh, CEO, mom," Um, you know, when I first started at the company, they say that new partners aren't going to be profitable for the first 18 months to 24 months. I met expectations on year one. Year two, I actually got the highest scorecard globally. And then year three was a year that I was laid off. And one of the things that I reflect upon is that year two, my highest performing year, I actually never looked at my scorecard. I lived like by my values and said no to clients that I didn't think we would best serve them, and really focused on doing the right thing. Year three, I lost myself. I think it was postpartum depression and anxiety. I really lost my core, and I started to focus so heavily on that scorecard. And the biggest lesson for me was that I should not allow an external force to develop any power over my worth. That my worth is from my internal scorecard, and that helped me really get through the breakup, and I'm so grateful for it. I'm so grateful. So thank you to all those from the past. You are great teachers, because I am actually experience a bountiful amount of joy, and I feel so much more aligned with my purpose, that I feel like there's just like this vibration, and all the challenges that you would think would be in the way for some reason are just not barriers, and they're not in the way.
I want to go back a little bit. There's so many points in what you just answered that I want to double click into for our audience. So let's talk about the concept of who you are versus the title you carry and the expectation of that title. Sit with that for a moment. How did you feel? Like, what did that moment of misalignment feel like, or the moments of misalignment feel like for you, both mentally, physiologically, or anything, if you can sort of take yourself back then and talk about?
Gosh, oh my gosh, it manifested physically. Like I felt like I was holding like a bowling ball in my chest area. Like I was so anxious that even though the time that I spend with my children now versus the time that I spent with them before has not shifted dramatically, but the presence, me being present, has. And I can see that develop in the relationships in terms of my connections with my children on a day-to-day basis. I would have missed these like core milestones of their being in awe of the world and learning the world if I had stayed in that old mindset and system.
Wow. I think it takes a lot of courage to look at what society expects of you and basically do like, yeah, no, I'm good. That's not my vibe. That's not for me. When you did it for the first time, and I'm going to call when the whole domino of your breakup with corporate America started, what did that feel like? Did it take a lot of courage, or did it just come naturally for you?
I think I was just on a hamster wheel for the majority of my life. Like all my life, we already knew the next step, right? So it's like, okay, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, then analyst to partner, right? And then you meet that and you're like, what? Like, aren't you supposed to feel something like a fulfillment of some nature? And I wasn't feeling that. I was actually feeling the opposite. I was feeling empty. And in the environment, I'm such a feeler. Like I'm an empath on steroids. So in that environment, you're told like you're told like you're not good enough, you need to do this for the next promotion, like all these different things. And so when I got the forced space, it was the biggest gift, because I started to think for myself. I got off the hamster wheel, um, and I started questioning myself, was this what I wanted to begin with? Like, and what gives me joy? And then I started immersing myself with other individuals that went through something similar. So I was a part of the Chief Executive Network. And for those that are familiar with that, it's women executives that get together to like share their learnings and help each other and support each other. And what I realized after my layoff was that there were so many women. I think there was a Chiefs in Transition WhatsApp group, and it went from 200 to over 500 in a period of 2.5 months. And I realized women and people of color were being impacted by job loss at a higher velocity than other individuals. And then I started to immerse myself in those conversations. And what came out of that was actually like I feel like I fell in love with Melissa, like that I had lost, because you're always given these messages, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. And as I immersed myself with other people, I realized, oh my gosh, like I am worthy. And ironically, I started writing in a journal last year, the day after I got laid off. And my hope for the year was to find worth in just being me versus doing. And I will say that I've met that, and it's not going away. I'm here to stay.
Someone from the comment section just said that group is still so large. Absolutely. And it's I find it interesting, at least having gone through parts of the journey myself, in terms of on the other side, looking back, how many I have encountered my career at senior levels and junior levels, both, that are going through that misalignment process where you're just constantly doing without necessarily realizing if that doing is aligned with being. And those are two very simple words, but I think it absolutely communicates different sentiments, if you will, just much like the story that we've heard from you earlier. So today's your last day with us. That sentence, I am sure, has shocked many, whether you're listening here right now or you're listening to the recording. If you ever experienced a layoff in your life, that was a moment where I think you feel like a boulder is sinking to the pit of your stomach. And there's a lot of doom and gloom scenarios that
Yeah.
play in the microseconds after that in your head. Having heard that sentence or something similar, Melissa, what did you feel like the hours, days, weeks, and months afterwards? What was that journey like for you, kind of processing it through over the course of the past year and a bit that took you to where you are today?
Gosh, okay. Right after it occurred, I kind of knew it was going to occur when I saw the, invitation that went on my calendar. And so I reached out to my community, which was really helpful. And I had nurtured a community and by giving to others, and I didn't actually expect the swarm of support and love from others. And it actually took me some time with therapy to be able to accept that for myself. Excuse me. But the first feeling was absolute devastation, like questioning, oh my gosh, like, am I worthy? Like, how did this even happen? How did I even get myself? And what ifing myself and shoulding all over yourself. People say you shouldn't, should have, would have, could have. Don't should all over yourself. It sounds like something else, but it's similar. And it was really tough. I cried. I was crying hysterically. I reached out. My mother was here. I was crying. She was like, she doesn't have the same empathy. So she was like, okay, good, good. You can do something else.
I'm
But
convinced Asian moms show love differently at this stage.
it's through food. So she fed
Yeah.
me. So I was like, okay, there we go. There's love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a love. And so, it was really, I lost sleep. I was hysterically crying, and it was really hard for me because it was embarrassing. And soon after, I was supposed to go to this Women's in America retreat. Shout out, awesome, awesome mentoring network. But it was supposed, the first question that they usually ask you is like, oh, what do you do? I was like, oh my freaking goodness. Like I was so scared of showing up because I've been an award collector all my life and had all these accolades and awards to show for. And this was the first time I felt like, they were all gone, and I made a personal choice to be honest and to still go to the retreat. And I actually didn't expect that, one of the last days of the retreat, there was this really wonderful activity that we did, which was, ask and give, or something like, what do you need and what can you give? And I didn't expect for me to do this. I think I probably blacked out for the 15 seconds that I was talking, but I stood up and I just said, I don't really have an ask. I just have a thank you to all of you. And I remember I almost like started crying. I had tears in my eyes of like the love and support. And I stood there and told everybody that I was laid off, which is like, nor I don't even know what gave me the reason or prompted me to do that in the first place, but that was one of the key moments where I was like, I accepted it. Like I announced it to all these like phenomenal badass executives in these space and my peers, what would have been what I thought embarrassing. And the reaction that I got from that was beyond. I ended up with 2 clients immediately. I had my first client the first Friday after being laid off. So it hadn't even been a week. I had to reactivate my LLC, and really focus on feeling that messy middle. And instead of like going from one milestone to the other and hitting that award and getting that award and getting that short-term high, I actually forcefully sat in that messy middle. I forcefully sat because I knew somewhere in my gut that there is a lesson to be learned here and that my life was going to be transformed somehow. I didn't know how, but I knew in my gut it was going to be somehow.
We're going to hold on to that thought of transformation for a moment. And I know the folks listening to us today are probably going to be like, oh, but that's just Melissa's story. She's a child prodigy of sorts. She is different. She's like the other category. I can never process it like that. I can never look at the world. The world will never treat me like this. What would you tell those folks who are having that thought in their heads right now, listening to what you have to share?
Oh my gosh. So, one thing to share was when I first was devastated. Everybody has their own journey and timeline based on their own lived experiences. We got to give ourselves and everybody else grace. But what I will tell you is I met so many people that were shared with me. So I met a former CEO that was laid off, and she said, Melissa, it took me a month to get out of bed. A month. Okay. And so many other women were throwing themselves back into the job market, especially in that Chiefs in Transition WhatsApp group, and they weren't getting the next interview. And they were blaming themselves, and they weren't getting it because they were showing up not healed. They were, showing up with anger and shame and sadness, And so I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much healing that needs to be done before we think about what's the next step.
Definitely. And for those listening to us right now, I'd love to get your thoughts on the conversation so far. Again, if you have any questions, anything, tips that you're looking for from Melissa, drop those in the comments as well. We're happy to read those out and kind of do a quick Q&A session after this. I have known Melissa for quite a bit. And I think two of the more critical lessons I've taken from this, from all of our conversations together is number one, you are not your title. Forget what the society and the labels people want to throw at you. You don't have to be that. The human understanding is only so limited in terms of what the brain requires for survival, which is categorization. So allow others to categorize with the appreciation that they need that level of categorization to help them understand the world, but you don't have to live to their expectation of categorization by any means. It's about carving your own path and understanding what does that alignment look like to you.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I've taken of all of our conversations together is about the doing versus being alignment. It's a lot of times what ends up happening, and I think interestingly, I see it more in women than other parts of the population, but when something happens, you just keep going back on that hamster wheel, especially in high performing women. I think you don't think about it and you're just constantly on that hamster wheel, thinking that that hamster wheel will get you somewhere. And that if you keep repeating that hamster wheel momentum, the next title, the next thing, the next opportunity will be better somehow, miraculously. And with that thought in mind, Melissa, I do want to pivot us one more time. Talk to me about Malu. What was that aha moment that you're like, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to do Malu journeys because it's needed.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I like sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, like I don't know any other option of being just completely honest. So Malu started through my own kind of frustration. And I'll backtrack. So I mentioned that I started therapy after postpartum of my second child, Henry. But I didn't tell you that I actually tried very hard to obtain a therapist years prior. It was probably like 6 years prior. And I think what they didn't tell me, because therapy is not something popular in the Chinese culture, is that it's not like you can go to a dentist and get your tooth pulled and then it's done. What's done is done, and you're good. Like going to find the right therapist is like dating your frogs before you find your prince. For all those daters up there.
Sorry
And
to all the therapists listening to this, but kind of sort of true. You know what we're talking about.
And it's interesting because I hated the process. I was triggered and gaslit by all these different. So I was talking to a former colleague of mine who identifies as an Indian woman, and she said that she went and met a like a white woman therapist who is culturally intelligent, and in that culture, like honoring your elders and everything is really, really prevalent. And she said the therapist was like, you have a boundary issue. Just work on boundaries. And she's like, woman, if I worked on boundaries, I'd be disowned by my family. So it doesn't work. And I went through something similar. These therapists I mentioned were like, oh, you're where I want my patients to be. I don't think you need me. I'm like, I'm proactively paying $350 for this terrible advice. And so some of that came in my own frustration in terms of the need to match and find the right person, and the need to have the same lived experiences. I also had a frustration from joining a senior executive women's network, because I felt very much that they took like a white woman's leadership template and applied it on the Asian community and the Black community. And that didn't really work. Like, people left in droves. And so those were two data points of mine that I was like, there's something missing here. The last part is I was sick and tired of compartmentalizing my needs, because at this moment, I'm Melissa. In the morning, at nighttime, anywhere I am, I'm Melissa, right? And I felt like I had to be, childhood, culture, trauma Melissa with my therapist. And then with my business coach, it was like the hustle of being a partner or an entrepreneur, right? But when it came to me being marginalized by a senior partner at a company, they were like, oh, do you have a therapist you could talk to? And I felt like I was re-triggering myself in every single conversation. Like, why isn't there a place that we could actually handle the past to the present and the present to the future? And then we started exploring it.
Awesome. And I know those of you listening to the last little bit of commentary, it's like, oh, it's about race. It's actually not about race. That's not what this whole thing is. It's about the context that you carry. So put yourself, all the ladies listening to this or all the guys listening to this, put yourself in the shoes. If you were to go to a female therapist or like a therapist of a different gender who didn't really understand your experience, who may not understand your physiological needs or anything along those lines, going and having to re-educate them every single time you're sitting through a therapy session. That's what Melissa is talking about. That's what Malu is talking about in terms of matching everyone so you don't have to re-traumatize yourself, having to educate those around you, especially those who are meant to provide you with a service with all of your past, so that they're now on board with what's going on. We do have a question from the audience. So this is from Sonali. Can you have both career drive and family/relationships? I know it's very black and white. Where or how did you find that harmony for yourself?
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's a great question. I will be honest again, I hate the word balance. I don't believe in it. I actually don't. I see things as like pillars, like or levers, if you will. Like, if you're pulling the lever of being a mother, your other stuff may not have as much attention. If you're doing the other, that you may not be able to go to, drop off your kid in every single drop off and pick up. There might be places where you need support. I see it as levers. And there are trade-offs depending on what lever that you choose. And I think that the balance and harmony, I think, exists in terms of internal alignment. I think it comes with, understanding the realistic nature of the world and the systems that we live in today, and to remove the blame from, within, and to actually understand where it's all coming from, and the false expectations of a mother, the lack of support as a mother, systems that don't really serve us. Not all of us start from the same place in a race. So to answer your question, I do think it's a lever, trade-offs, but being aware of what the different systems are doing and what the pros and cons are, making a choice with that information, I think is really, really important and can give you.
And I want to reemphasize the word choice that you just said, because realistically, if we look at the world, everything is hard. Everything that you're trying to do is hard. Focusing on your career is hard. Focusing on your family is hard. But going back to the notion of choice and alignment, I think to what you said before, it's about picking that hard. It's about making the choice and understanding what fulfills you the most, if you will. So we are 45 minutes into this session. Oh, and Michael had to drop, but he's saying you're an inspiration. Keep going.
Mhm.
Let's talk a little bit more about the practical side of things for our
Okay,
audience, right?
sure.
Um, Having gone through the journey that you have gone through and knowing that our audience are on different stages of their career and their journeys, what are some of the advice or practical tips, if you will, that they can put into place like next week, next month, you would leave with folks in different stages? And let's get started with those who are sort of like the junior level professionals, like 5 years into their careers.
My advice would be build your village early. You know how you hear the term "it takes a village." That actually, my therapist studied like social anthropology, so she knows different communities from the past, and she said that actually came from, it does take a village to raise a child, and I think it also takes a village for your mental health. And only recently have we gotten into this place where we're more isolated, even though we're more digitally connected than ever before. And I think build your village early is important because networking shouldn't be transactional, it's relational. And if I were to reflect on how wonderful having that Women in America community was, and the community, it was from giving, and doing good deeds for others and not actually expecting it in return. And when I was in a struggle and when I was having a potential mental breakdown and identity crisis, they all came with open arms. So that would be my takeaway.
And I think just to build on that point a little bit longer for the audience, yes, build yourself a village, but there are also, and this is not just opinion, there have been sociology studies done on the fact that you are a reflection of, I think the number was 5 people who are the closest to you. So understanding where you want to be and where do you want those relationships to be and how to build yourself that village is absolutely critical in this day and age, especially given the digital isolation that we're all going through. What about someone who is mid-level in their career? So let's say about that 5 to 8/10 year range. What would you tell them? Like they've been in the professional workplace long enough. They have seen, fortunate or unfortunate, a lot of the good and bad of working in the corporate
Right,
world. And some of them may be disenfranchised. Others may be like, okay, maybe that next role, maybe the next thing will bring me joy. What would you
right.
tell them?
I think I would probably boil it down to two things. One is stop playing small. So if I were to reflect upon my time at Ogilvy and Mather, I was like, okay, heads down, work hard, you should get the rewards, while all these people were surpassing me that did probably 10% of the work. And I was like, what the hell? Until I had an aha where, oh my gosh, Ogilvy's like a branding and marketing agency and organization. Why don't I apply what we do for everybody else to myself? And I started to be like, okay, what did John Smith do? He's talking about himself and so instead of doing just the good work, talk about the good work, and you can talk about it strategically. If you know that you're going to bump into, executive A, B, or C, at the water cooler, I started to figure out, okay, how do I embed, for a chief growth officer, I'm talking about, all the leads that I have, for a chief culture officer, I'm talking about the importance of, community within the business. So being able to brand yourself and not being afraid about it, because if you don't speak up for yourself, not always will you have somebody to do so. And then my second one is know when it's time to walk away. I didn't know for the longest time. I needed to wait. I'm that type of person who thought I was being resilient, but I was just being stupid. And I was literally needed to be banged on the head with a pan to realize when to walk away. You can try so hard to be, a CEO of an organization, but are you going to chisel that into your tombstone? And it's really the dash between when you're born and when you die that matters. And I don't want mine to say CEO. I want to say like she played big and she made a difference and she was a great mother and her children are proud of her. That's it.
Wow. Okay, that's another mug moment that we're going to put on there. It's like it's about the dash between the two dates. I think it's so interesting what you talk about, which is crafting your story for the audience. Because a lot of folks, I think, listening to this are probably like, oh, but that's just like playing corporate politics and everything else. One thing I do want to leave everyone with, and this took me years to get it into my head as well, is the system is set up the way the system is set up. And the corporations are set up the way they're set up. At some point, you have to tell yourself, if you can't beat them, join them, as long as they serve your purpose, your alignment, and helps you get you on the way to your path. All right. And for the audience, if you're still listening to this, drop any questions you might have for Melissa as well. I'm sure she's more than happy to answer those. So, talk to me for the senior level professionals, then, like the ones who've made it, the one who has done the hard work, put in everything they can to get to the C-suite, to get to the partner level roles, to get to the incredibly senior level roles. Having gone through that yourself, what
Mhm.
would you tell them in terms of reflecting back on your journey as like the practical advice or tip that they can or need to?
I would say invest in your mental and emotional health as much as you invest in your career, because success without fulfillment is actually failure. And for me right now, and I know this is a little bit different, but I wish I knew that I could treat my job like a money market investment. I in the past put all my money, if I were to keep this metaphor, into this risky investment, which is this one full-time job. And now that I've diversified, if something doesn't work out in one area, it doesn't kill me. It's not my whole life. Like, I've diversified enough where if one works, great, that's enough. And do the research, figure out like the money that you need to bring into your family, and if you're caring for others, whether or not they're younger children or your elders, what does that mean? And then when you have that data, then you can actually make real data informed choices. And I say that because when I was first laid off, I felt like I was reacting like I was going to be on the streets the next day. And that's not actually reality. That was how I felt. And yes, feelings are valid, but part of grounding myself during that time was to get the data. And that helped me be able to make intelligent decisions. And so those would be my tips.
Let's talk about the analogy a little bit more. So, when you say diversify your portfolio, what do you mean? What did that look like for you, and what can that look like for others?
So, when it happened organically, and everybody's kind of journey might look a little bit different. But what happened was right after a layoff, I got my first client on that Friday. So I had to reactivate an LLC. So I have a consulting LLC doing a lot of the same things that I did in the past. And because of going back to a former advice, because I have such a great ecosystem of people that that know me, that know the true me. Um, I'm not seeing any decline in terms of the level of large scale transformation projects coming my way just because I'm one person. I have an ecosystem of people that I've worked with that can be my team members that I can vouch for. And then the other one is, that helped fund what we were doing and the research that we were self funding with Stanford professors on Malu to really think through the model of alignment and also understand where people are on their journey. So, some one thing that I think is very special about Malu and future cohorts is that there might be people that just want the coaching, and there might be people that want just the therapy, or there might be people that need both or are interested in both. And we want to meet you where you are. And I think that there's not enough customized approaches like that to meet people like a human, a nuanced, nonlinear human.
And speaking of Malu, for those who are listening to us right now, if they're interested to learn more about your journey or more about Malu journey, where can they find you?
Oh my gosh, just reach out to me, DM me on LinkedIn, or, we have Malu Journey. I'm Melissa at malujourney.com. If you want to reach out to me, I'd love to set up time to discuss how we can hopefully benefit and create a village for you at the same time.
Awesome. So we do have a few responses that says amazing advice, love the diversified career concept, great tips and advice. So we are probably in the last 5 minutes of this live stream right now. I'm going to say, and we did not prep for this, so this is like ad lib for those of you who are listening to us. Um, 3 tips for women, professional career women, or just women in general, in taking into the context of all of the sort of macroeconomics, the geopolitics that is happening in this world right now. What are the 3 things you would tell women who are listening to this from your experience, your perspective, in terms of how to approach this environment and how to make sure that they still stay true to themselves in this environment?
I would say I can think of two so far. One is keep asking yourself questions. So if you're asking yourself questions like, am I supposed to be feeling this way, or why am I not fulfilled? Keep asking yourself those questions, because the more you ask, the more you're closer to the answer. The second one would be create space. I did not realize the value of space. I actually was taught that productivity was so close and aligned with my worth through my culture that I never understood why people would sit um, you know, in, in parks. Like, I was like, oh my God, what a waste, And now I'm like, oh my goodness, I totally get it. You actually are wiser, you should have told me that. So creating that space, a lot of stuff can happen in that space, that messy middle. That's where the transformation happens. That's when you feel uncomfortable. And then the last one is embrace your community. I think that is so important. It took me a while, and I think it was in my own like self-love journey that happened in my 40s last year. But once I was able to embrace that journey, it made me realize I was worth that support.
Awesome. And that actually brings us to the end of this live event. I do want to thank Melissa for joining us here today. And if you're listening to us, hopefully you got some tips, a few tips and advice, if you will, out of this entire conversation. Again, as Melissa has said, feel free to DM her on LinkedIn or melissa@malujourney.com if you want to learn more about Malu Journey, what she is up to, or if you just have more one-on-one questions that you would like to ask her, which I completely appreciate if you don't want to do it on a LinkedIn live event. And with that said, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. Really appreciate your time, and hope we all got something out of this. Take care for now.